Treatable. Really, it's treatable. Yes, it's treatable. It's the Treatable podcast. Say what's on your mind. It's the Treatable podcast. Real, coming, treatable. It's the Treatable podcast. It's all on the Treatable podcast.
How do we treat the effects of trauma? From EMDR to somatic methods, the world of trauma treatment offers diverse paths of healing. But no matter which method one chooses, whether it's bilateral stimulation, nervous system regulation, or another treatment, each shares a common goal: helping you feel safe in your own skin again. Welcome to Treatable, the podcast where we unpack mental health topics with experts who show us that change is possible. This episode is part 2 of our discussion on trauma. In the last episode, we talked with Dr. Michael Barnes about where trauma comes from, why understanding trauma is important, and how it affects the physical body. And today, we're going to focus on how to treat trauma. I am again joined by the renowned trauma and addiction expert, Dr. Michael Barnes, who is the founder of the Michael Barnes Family Institute and author of When the Solution Becomes the Problem, a book exploring the complex intersection of addiction, trauma, and family dynamics. And today we're going to share more insights on trauma to help us understand how to really heal. And if you didn't listen to our previous episode on what is trauma, I totally recommend you go there first to get some context for our discussion today.
Treatable podcast. It's all on the Treatable podcast.
Dr. Barnes, thank you for joining us today again.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to come back. I appreciate it.
So when we last left off, we were talking all about where trauma originates, why it's important to understand how addiction and other things can be a reaction to trauma. And now people are like, okay, but what do? I realize that there's a problem. I realize that there's something that's happened to me in my life, a big change that's affected me. What's the next step? Where do you start when you are trying to help somebody overcome their trauma? What are the steps?
So I tend to take a developmental perspective on it. It's a person by the name of Judith Herman wrote a book many years ago who talked about the triphasic model of trauma therapy. One is starting with safety and kind of looking at trauma symptoms, looking at the autonomic nervous system, looking at issues like drinking and drug use, that we want to begin the process of helping to get rid of any of the behaviors that have been serving as a coping strategy rather than to deal with the trauma. The second phase is what she called mourning and remembrance, the idea of sort of grieving the losses that came along with the trauma and telling the story. And so a lot of times our clients will say, well, when are we going to work on my trauma? And we've been working pretty diligently on the safety piece and really helping them begin to work on trauma and the regulation of trauma symptoms so that they can stay sober, so that they can then continue on in the process of working with the trauma. So in the mourning and remembrance phase would be using models like EMDR and somatic experiencing, and cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the one that's researched the most for helping clients begin to heal from trauma. And then the third phase is what we would just call sort of reintegration, reconnecting that individual with a peer group and friends and family in ways that are different than the trauma had. So that's where I start, is the idea of, I always start with safety. I always start with a real focus on symptoms. The more we tell the story, I think I talked about this last time, the more it changes. And so the idea of going into the story just triggers all the same nervous system reactions. So we want to work on helping to calm that nervous system down so that a person has learned to be able to regulate. So when they're doing this trauma-specific work, as the nervous system ramps up, they can calm down to the point of benefiting from that therapy. So what are the symptoms that they have? Learning how to regulate the autonomic nervous system, like trauma-informed yoga. It's a great way to reconnect the body to to kind of the sense of safety. One of the things clients say a lot is that after a trauma, they've sort of lost they say, I have a hard time telling the difference between being safe and feeling safe. And so even when I am safe, I don't feel safe. And so they're always anxious. And the idea that we can begin to help them reconnect to their bodies, help them reconnect emotionally, actually is what's teaching them to begin to be connected, to begin to recognize, yeah, wow, even though I don't feel safe necessarily, I really am safe. So I can begin the process of calming the nervous system.
Yeah, let's break these down. It almost sounds like it's a biopsychosocial approach, right? And as you mentioned, the first step is safety, meaning that I can feel safe and also connected to my body. And I do not have substances in my body that are going to prevent me from being able to experience myself. So, the first step, am I getting enough sleep? Do I have food? If I'm hungry, if I'm sleepy, it's going to be really hard to work through my trauma, right? Sometimes this also has to do with medication, right? Do I have anything that's allowing me to just at least stabilize myself? Not about trying to self medicate, but to where my biology is allowing me to sit in the chair and communicate with a therapist or another person who's going to help me process this. But the biggest thing that you mentioned when it comes to this first step of overcoming trauma is being able to connect with your body and to feel safe and to self regulate. Meaning that if you feel your heart rate is quickening or if your breath pace is changing, you are not going to be able to talk about your trauma, experience your trauma, if you don't have a release or an escape valve, a way for you to be able to come back down to baseline and to be able to work through and to talk through these things. So, the first step before you do anything is about establishing trust and creating different ways to self regulate. And you mentioned a few of these. You talked about mindfulness and grounding work. Is there anything else that you do specifically with clients that are really helpful for them to be able to connect with themselves in the present moment and to be able to understand that they're a human being sitting in a place and that they're okay?
Yeah, I mean, there's a technique that I like to use that we just call resourcing. It's so when we think about trauma memories, it's all sensory based, right? That the left side of our brain is asleep, the right side of our brain is active. And so it's using a similar process to how trauma memories are created to resolve trauma memories. And it's helping people to imagine a place that they have been or that they dream of or they've imagined where there's no stress, where they're completely relaxed. And then having them begin to think about how do I, like if I'm there, what do I smell when I'm there? What do I see when I'm there? What do I hear? And so imagine the beach. And so people will say, well, yeah, beach is a pretty common place for me. And when you ask them, they'll say, well, I can smell suntan lotion and I can hear the seagulls and I feel the heat on my skin. I can hear the sound of the water lapping on. And so it's using that same kind of sensory memory that when we want to regulate ourselves, we can just take a few minutes, remember that place, and our brain begins to react in a way that calms us down. But you have to practice it. And if you practice it, you get really good at it. And I've seen it change people's lives, just being able to regulate it that way. So I think I use that a lot. For people who do have a history or a tendency to dissociate or to, rather than to be anxious, they have a tendency to sort of blank out or to get sleepy or get cold, those kinds of things. A lot of time it's just movement. I'll have them do push-ups against the wall. I have them go for a walk. I have them, a friend of mine keeps golf balls on the floor of his office so that when they get dissociating, they can roll a golf ball under their foot and it grounds them back into the kind of real world, into the moment. I have a poster on my office wall that it's a triangle, and it's asking when someone has a trauma response or when someone starts to get anxious, pay close attention to when they realize it, to begin to think about, what am I thinking about? And they will almost always be thinking about something that creates a stress response. And what are they feeling emotionally? What are they feeling in their body? Well, geez, my neck's getting tight. I'm getting a little bit of a headache, or my heart is racing. And so beginning to tie the biological symptoms that we experience with the recognition of the need to resource is really, really helpful. Another thing, and this is a little different than that, but I really want people to be open to looking at family history. And if there is prior trauma in prior generations, addiction in prior generations, if I grew up in a family with an addicted parent, those kinds of things, I might be experiencing more developmental trauma. And so that idea of being open to, how did those childhood events, how did my family that I grew up in influence how I feel about this trauma, how I'm reacting to it, the solutions that I have identified to try to fix it. In family therapy, we say more of the same always results in more of the same. And so if I always go back to the same strategy, because that's the way I think is the right way to do it, but it doesn't work, then we will continue to go to that, keep trying harder, more aggressive in our attempts to make it go away. But it's probably never going to make it go away, because it's tied to some other kinds of coping strategy. So being open to really looking at, am I the only one in my family that's ever had trauma? And how did the other people in my family deal with it? Like my mother had severe trauma, and we all dealt with it by walking very gingerly around her and really beginning to take care of her. But the problem with that was the kids were taking care of the parent. The parent wasn't taking care of the kids. And so it created, that kind of developmental trauma. And so being open to learning from our family of origin is a really good foundation.
I would imagine that that's also kind of connected to the second part, which is kind of telling that trauma story, or remembering and mourning, right? But before we hop to that part, I just want to summarize a few of the key points that you mentioned. When we experience trauma, it happens in the right side of our brain. And the right side of our brain is also where we store all of our physical sensations when it comes to what we see, what we touch, what we smell. And so, as we mentioned in a previous episode, there are often triggers that we will encounter in everyday life, whether it's a smell or something that they see or something that they hear, that brings them back to a moment in which they feel like the trauma is happening all over again. What's interesting about this is because, as you mentioned in the previous episode, we all come into this world being able to do three things. We can connect, we can fight or flight, or we can freeze and dissociate, right? And so sometimes even our minds do not remember the trauma, but our bodies do. And there's a great book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score, which is a pretty common book in understanding trauma as it relates to the body. But one of the things that he mentions throughout his work is that, hey, your body is going to be telling you things. Where are you feeling this in your body? How does this feel? Is your chest tight? Is your heart beating fast? Is your breathing quickening? All of these things. And those are clues that help us to understand. And until we can look at our physical state and come up with a unique coping strategy, self-regulation skill to be able to get ourselves back to baseline, it's not a good idea to go into the storytelling and to the trauma side of it, because you're going to go into a place that you're not able to get out of, right? So we need some tools to be able to allow us to venture into this environment, to understand, to unpack some things that maybe we haven't thought about in a long time. And maybe we've pushed down for a long time. Maybe it's way deep down inside. And when it comes to the surface, we need a way to be able to reintegrate ourselves back into our physical bodies. And so this first step is all about figuring out the coping skill, self-regulation style that you can use to feel safe. because no healing, whether it's physical or emotional, can take place unless you first feel safe. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. Your reference to Bessel van der Kolk is really an important one, because he says that your trauma trigger is not going to come in the form of a story. It's going to come in the form of a reaction. And so that idea of being more aware of what is being stored in our body, rather than, I got to tell the story. And when we get to mourning and remembrance, we'll talk about how there's a difference between telling the story and telling the story. They're different.
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle, and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. So let's talk about this. Step 1 is safety, establishing a sense of safety. Step 2 is about mourning and remembering. We have a few challenges when it comes to mourning and remembering. One, because the story has never really been able to find its narrative flow. Trauma, when you're experiencing trauma, doesn't take place in the past. It feels like it's happening now. You're living in it. You're carrying it with you. An analogy that's helped me is like, imagine you were shot with a bullet, and instead of the bullet passing through your body, the bullet stays in your body, right? And so when the outside might look healed, but inside, if you move a certain way, or if you eat something, or if you hear a sound, all of that stuff reminds you of this thing that you actually haven't passed through you, that actually is still within you. And it can be really dangerous. So one of the most important things when we think about gunshot wounds is to be able to remove the debris. And
Right.
trauma is when something is stuck in that wound that prevents you from being able to heal all the way. How do you go about helping somebody mourn and remember the story of their trauma? What does that process look like when you're working with clients?
Like, I'll give an example of our son's accident. I talk about that accident every time I do a presentation. And I talk about it so much that I can talk about it without any emotion. But there are times where something will remind me of it. Some out of the blue thing where I feel the grief, I feel the sadness. Now, he's fine. He's 37 and doing great. But the event's still right there. Like, there is the potential for it to be right there. And so I start by having a client tell me the story in a general way. The best they can tell it, the best way they remember it, to talk a little bit about what's going on in their body as they're telling me the story, what's going on, what are they thinking, what are they feeling, what's the body reaction, those kinds of things. And I would assume when they tell that story at a 10,000 foot level, that they're not going to have a huge emotional release. They've told that story probably enough times that at that level they can do it. And then we'll begin to start working with, I will want them to tell the story from well before the event happens, because I don't want them to start right at the beginning of the event, because their autonomic nervous system is going to be so activated at that point. I want them to tell me to where we're walking up to the event, so that as the body starts activating while they're getting closer, I can keep them regulated. So that I want them to be able to feel their feelings when they're telling that story. But if they just run into it or rush into it, they tend to get overwhelmed and not be able to remember and not be able to feel it. So I was trained in a model called CAR, Containment and Autonomic Regulation Therapy, where you kind of begin telling the story, and then whenever you start to feel things in your body, whenever you're starting to have a kind of an emotional reaction, we kind of stop at that point and we process that so that the person can begin to understand, well, what's going on with you as you're getting closer to this? How are you reacting to that? And then they start at the beginning again, and they now can walk a little bit further past that spot and before they start having a reaction. And so it's called like a working window. You're moving them closer and closer to the working window so that when they get there, they actually have a chance to grieve. And we survived the trauma, but what did we lose in that process? We may have lost our sense of safety in the world. We may have lost our confidence. We may have lost our ability to trust people. Our attachment that we developed as kids now might be gone. That whole process of connecting to people, we may be overriding that at this point and really into more fight or flight. So again, slowly, methodically telling the story to the point of allowing them to regulate. So that's why if we do a really good job in the safety phase, then when we're telling the story, that person's been doing it long enough that they can begin to regulate and then come back and tell the story, feel their feelings. And then when they get dysregulated, we can regulate them again and just slowly work through the story. So it's not like sometimes it can take multiple sessions to go through the whole event. If they can get through the whole story in an emotional place, but not a dysregulated place or not dissociative place, then they're making significant progress.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of unpack one of the things I heard you say that's actually really powerful is the idea of everyone needs the chance to be able to grieve their trauma. And what does it mean to grieve, right? There's a few different things that we can think about. One, I cannot grieve if I'm not safe. Think about if you're fleeing a natural disaster and someone next to you falls down, but you have to get up. You don't have the time to be able to help this person because you're trying to fight for your own life. And the consequences of that is that you never really get to process the situation. Safety is a predecessor for being able to grieve. We can grieve when we feel safe. If you've ever seen people in the midst of war or in the midst of severe trauma, they're in a state of shock, and they might even seem on the surface like everything is fine because they're still in survival mode. But when they're able to calm their bodies down, when they're able to stop and to take a breath and to actually think about what happened to them, there's a whole different type of healing. And to your point, a whole lot of other things that they get to uncover that they might have left behind, right? Like trust, like confidence, like connection that they didn't even really know that they were missing. And one of the commonalities between all types of psychotherapy when it comes to trauma is you go into the trauma story or the trauma tale, and then you also undulate or switch back into or reorienting yourself back into your body. And this is kind of the same thing as EMDR or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Can you explain how EMDR is similar to other types of treatment of trauma and why it can be a helpful way for somebody to overcome trauma?
Well, first of all, they start with the same thing that I was just talking about, with resourcing, with teaching that person how to regulate their nervous system so that in the process of telling the story, they can stay regulated. So the idea of EMDR came from a person who was, I think, walking her dog, and she began to realize she was thinking about this event that had happened and realizing that her eyes were moving back and forth, the idea of stimulating right brain, then left brain, right brain, left brain. And if you think about it, the trauma, the left brain wasn't involved in, right? It was shut off. And so it's really allowing the individual to process the event, maybe for the first time, using both sides of their brain. And so where before they just had an autonomic reaction to it, now the left brain can say, well, hold it a second. That makes sense. This is what we're having. I've seen these remarkable insights people have. I was watching a session with these Vietnam vets. One was the therapist and one was the vet. The guy who had been living in Vietnam in his brain for 30 years, finally he was doing EMDR and he said, I was 19 years old. I reacted like any 19-year-old would in that environment. And all of a sudden you began to see the shift beginning to happen. The idea of, I'm not such a bad guy. I'm not as dysfunctional as I think. I'm one of a number of people that had this event. And so I really like the ability to kind of process, and then you stop for a second and you let it kind of percolate, if for lack of a better word, and then come back and start to talk about it. So the problem, if you're only right-brained while the trauma is happening, then you don't have a narrative, right? So you don't have a story. All you have are these memories. Well, it doesn't have an end, and you can't grieve something that hasn't ended. And there's a term, and I can't remember the term, but the idea of how difficult it is when a body is never found for the family to actually grieve, because there's always still that hope that maybe that it's been a mistake and they come back. And so if my trauma never has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that the processing of the trauma gives it an end. Once I've processed the trauma, I can begin to process the grief. That's the thing that I think about, is if I can help them get to a point to where, I survived it, and I'm, clearly grateful for that. Now I have to deal with the loss.
Yeah, to think about how it affected you, the things, because within trauma or any type of severe change, there is always something that's lost. Within developmental trauma, there's a loss in relationship, there's a loss in being a kid, there's a loss of innocence, there's a loss of any of the irreducible needs that you need when you're a child, like Gordon Newfield talks about, right? Like being able to play with folks unstructured, or knowing that when you cry, you don't have to work to be able to get your parents' attention, that they just give it to you, right? Like all of these things are things that we need as kids or as humans. And if we don't get it, it's stuff that we're leaving behind. And I think your expression, the analogy of the body, makes a lot of sense. If there's no closure when it comes to this story and you're ruminating, you're in this loop, and it's not a beginning, middle, and end. It's happening every day right now. And sometimes you don't even realize you're in the loop. Sometimes you don't even realize that you actually never left the trauma. You just took it with you. It can be extremely challenging to overcome. So EMDR is like a tool. There's many types of things, but they all have that similarity of being able to help you coherently, chronologically tell the story, to process it, to sit with your feelings, and to look at it from a different perspective. One last thing about EMDR before we talk about some other types of therapies and what to do next is I've also heard EMDR being connected to how we sleep in REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. If you look at somebody when they're in REM sleep, their eyes are darting left to right. And it's one of the ways that our brains will process information to say, hey, this was an important thing that happened today. This wasn't, right? And so it's sifting through your memories and trying to say what can be tapped away and forgotten and what needs to be stored into long-term memory. And so this process of left to right with our eyes, or sometimes you're following a light left to right, or you have hand triggers that vibrate left to right as you're doing this thing, allows you to tap into that same thing that you might be doing when you're doing REM sleep. And given all of EMDR is still, there's a lot that we don't understand, but some people theorize that it can be connected with the processing that your body actually does when you're sleeping. But with trauma, it's like it never got processed in the first place. So any other therapies that come to mind as really important therapies when it comes to understanding trauma, reorienting yourself back into your body, that kind of thing?
The one that I think is most interesting is somatic experiencing. And somatic experiencing was developed by Peter Levine, and it's really looking at how energy gets trapped in the nervous system, and that unresolved trauma results in the inability to sort of process that energy out, or to finish. The term that they use is an unfinished defensive response, meaning that the event happened suddenly, the event happened severely, and the person never really had the chance to complete what their body wanted or needed to do. And so the CAR model that I was trained in was developed by one of Peter Levine's proteges. And so it's similar. But it's very much that pendulating process where they'll be telling the story, and as they begin to dysregulate, it's allowing them to kind of sit in that dysregulation and let the body do what it's trained to do. And Levine is an ethologist. He studied animals as well as humans. And he got the idea that in watching, if an animal is being chased by a lion, if the animal gets away, it doesn't go back to the herd. It goes and lays down and shakes. And that our body does the same thing. Levine got hit by a car and they wanted to give him medication. And he said, no, I have this process that I need to go through. And he did the procedure right on the road with severe injuries and never got post-traumatic stress disorder. So the idea of having someone tell the story, and when their body starts to react with the energy that's stored from unresolved trauma, that the body will go through shaking, it'll go through very tense muscles. I've seen people who were in T-boned car accidents that their hands go up as if they were going to try to block the car. And so to finish that defensive response, because the event was so fast. And so it's really what I do as I'm having them tell the story is asking them to sit as quietly and as still as they can to let the body complete whatever it feels the need to complete. And so I will tell a client in that process, if you have a thought or if you have an emotion, I want you to just say it out loud. And so they say it. And I might say, okay, well, let that go. That's not what we're here to work on. It might be something completely unrelated to the trauma. But if it's, I feel really scared, I might say to the client, say that again. I feel really scared. Say that one more time. And all of a sudden the body starts to react to the recognition and realization of the terror that the person's experiencing. So somatic experiencing is a way of cleansing the body of that sort of energy that the body would have if we had allowed it to, purged itself of after the trauma, but we don't.
Yeah. The last thing I would say is I would think about neurofeedback when we think about the biological part of experiencing trauma. Sometimes when we experience trauma as kids, well, all the time as we experience trauma as kids, it affects the development of our brain. We are in unique situations, and sometimes our processing skills, our problem solving skills, our ways to be able to connect with people are all challenged, stunted, and aren't able to grow in the capacity that we need to. Neurofeedback allows us to be able to help work on some of those processes. And there's a lot to it, but basically it is putting your brain up to a machine, trying to get your brain into a state that is calm, that allows it to be able to understand that it is okay and safe, that it is at peace, and to recognize what that actually feels like when you are that way. And we can tell through different waves, like alpha waves in your brain, whether or not you are in that state of peace, the same type, because it's the same thing that's released when you're, in deep sleep. It's the same thing that's released when you're in states of mindfulness meditation. And so that biological feedback, when we think about trauma, we think about, oh, I just need to talk about my feelings. It is so much more than that. It is really about connecting and growing and merging the experiences that have happened in our minds, in our emotions, and in our bodies, and being able to let all three components talk to each other in a way that allows them to move on. Anything else you want to tie up here?
So, it's a biopsychosocial response. And so that idea of, okay, we've worked on the autonomic nervous system, we've worked on the story, and now it's about how do we reintegrate into society? How do we begin to trust people again? How do we find our tribe, if you will, of individuals that we have similar ideas to? And so we start with just being honest, saying yes when you mean yes, no when you mean no, and beginning a process of developing relationships. I'm a huge advocate for peer work. And so finding kind of peer trauma coaches, if you will. And I love coaches as well as therapists. I think there's certain things that coaching does that therapy can't. And so we can do a lot of psychoeducation with coaching. We can do a lot of kind of the peer coach can talk about their own recovery. They can begin to make that connection. One of the things that individuals, particularly family members who have their own secondary trauma, really shy away from is engaging with peers who have been through what they've been through. And there's often a great shame experience with that. There's often fear and fear of judgment, so those kinds of things. And so the idea of overcoming one's fears, again, the difference between being safe and feeling safe, to realize that going into that room or talking to those individuals may be scary, but you're safe. And so the idea of putting all of the principles that you've learned into place, into a process of really community, like healing in the community. And I think it's where a lot of family work gets done. The idea of everyone thinks, well, if this person deals with their trauma, their family's going to be thrilled. Well, the family is thrilled, but it's different now. The person's changing. They have an opinion now when maybe in the past they were just really isolated. So you may have some conflict within the family. You may have the family still being really hypervigilant and controlling to try to take care of the needs of this person. And they've been through therapy and they're like, I don't need you to do that anymore. Well, that's easier said than done to shut that off as a parent or as a partner. And so the reintegration part is really beginning to do family work and getting, and I'm not saying family supporting them. I'm saying families healing as a family. And that's a huge difference. This idea of we're a family that supports a loved one who has trauma is really different than we are a family in recovery because we've all been impacted by that trauma. And so finding really good family therapists that understand trauma and not only its individual reaction, but to its systemic reaction in this person's life. And so that to me are the two biggest components of that reintegration is healing the family and then finding people that taking those risks, using the new skills to begin to find friends, improved work relationships, things like that. Being back in the world.
Yeah. Our relationships are everything. They're the way that we determine our happiness. They're the way that we feel connected and understood. They're the way that allow us to feel like life is worth living and meaningful. And they're also oftentimes the greatest source of struggle within our lives. Mm-hmm. Alfred Adler, who is an individual psychologist and contemporary of Freud, talked about that all problems are interpersonal problems. And if you think about it, that makes sense. I mean, I could probably think of a few problems that don't have to do with talking to other people, but the majority of problems that we experience in our modern era have to do with the way that we relate and communicate with others. And when there's a breakdown in that kind of communication, when we don't feel understood, when we don't feel connected, when we don't feel like people get where we're coming from, you can quickly spiral into feeling tragically unique and feeling like you don't belong. So some of the key things I heard you mention is like these peer groups, which is where you get to be in a form of group therapy with other people who understand your struggle so that you know that you're not alone, so that you know that there are other people who have come out on the other side and get where you're coming from. There's also relationships and family coaches who can talk about the specific dynamics, because just because one person gets better doesn't mean that the whole family gets better. And you have to work through all of those things in order to be able to do this. It's a lot. Like when you take a step back and you look at working through trauma, it is not a simple process. But I love the way that you broke it down. It's establishing a sense of physical safety. It is being able to mourn and grieve and to process the trauma, to remember the trauma in a way that allows you to feel safe and to work through that. And then it's about being able to connect with others so that you can feel reintegrated back into the world, because if you've been living through trauma or carrying trauma with you, you have not fully been living with the world because you've still been stuck somewhere in the past. I want to remind listeners and watchers where they can go to learn more about you and your work and connect with you. Where can they go to find you?
My website's the best place at www.treatable, Dr. Mike Barnes, Dr. Mike Barnes .com. And it has some bio stuff in there. It has some blogs that I've written. It has some information on my book, that kind of stuff. So that's probably the place to start.
Amazing. Yes. And I had a feeling we're going to get a lot of questions, and he's graciously agreed to give his email with this so that you can reach out to him and connect with him as well. So he's a real human being who has a ton of experience and can help you sort through some of these things. So a great resource. You'll find all that linked up in the description box and show notes below. Listeners, watchers, this trauma thing, it is real, but it is much more common than you think. And with the help of connecting with folks, feeling safe in your body, and working through and remembering this story, it is also treatable. We will see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode is created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.